It's me again. Hello. You'll see a lot of me in the next few days. So if I could ask Joe Rafferty and Josephine Ocloo to join me on the stage, we're going to start off with our first session this morning, which is looking at just culture. We do have a special guest who unfortunately can't be with us here in person this morning, but I'm hoping through the joys of technology that he can hear me now, and he's going to pop up on the screen any minute. So, Australia, this is England talking. Can you hear me, Sidney?
I can hear you well.
Excellent.
See your face.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Sidney. So, I just wanted to, first of all, ask you, I mean, you are effectively the father of just culture. You are known for the theory. And when we hear just culture discussed here in the UK, sometimes I think people don't almost understand what we mean by just culture, and it can mean different things to different people. So it's probably worth us starting off with just explain to us from your perspective, what do you mean by just culture? What is just culture?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. To be the father of just culture, I thought it was an immaculate conception, but here I am, father of just culture. So, it has not been immaculately conceived. It's a messy concept, and so there's lots of possible definitions. However, in the experience of working with organizations in healthcare and elsewhere, certain ideas start congealing that seem better than others. And so to me, a just culture, Sean, begins by not seeing your people as a problem that you need to control with more bureaucratic and punitive means. It's a culture that sees people as the solution to harness, not as the problem to control. It's a culture that doesn't tell people what to do by more and more and more bureaucratic means, but that asks them what they need. And I think in the long run, but Joe will have more to tell about this, it's a culture that restores trust and accountability in a forward-looking sense. What do we need to do now? What issues have been identified? Whose accountability, responsibility is it to work on this now? A just culture is a culture that ultimately reduces the downward pressure on openness, disclosure, willingness to learn and share.
Okay, but when we talk about that, that's a theory. Do we have evidence that where just culture has been used, it is effective, it does change the outcome for people?
So Joe, who's on your panel at Mersey Care, will give you ample evidence by whatever measure you desire, in terms of the happiness, in terms of absenteeism, but also in terms of the dollar value. And so, by all means, there's an increasing amount of evidence saying that if you apply particularly a restorative just culture, not a retributive one, then that has significant and measurable consequences for the good. Also in terms of patient outcomes, which is, of course, the first goal we should be striving to achieve.
And I know you came over to the UK last year, and we had a pleasant conversation about the NHS's approach to just culture. What's your assessment of where the NHS is? Because you talk about restorative and retributive, and I think many people might say we have the latter here in the NHS. What's your assessment?
Yeah. I think they're right. If the latter is indeed a retributive just culture, which is not so just, except for those who have the power, you're right, Sean. I think that is indeed the case. Retribution and a retributive just culture is typically organized around questions of which rule is broken, who did it, how bad is this, or how often have they done it already, and what should the proportional consequences for the individual be. It's not a very constructive way to ultimately learn, and I don't think it's a good way to involve the patient, the first victims, into the conversation either. Restorative practices do that much better.
And here in the NHS, we have a whole professional regulation system that is effectively geared towards striking off those rogue clinicians who, obviously, it was all their fault. And equally, we have moves now to bring in regulation of NHS managers, etc. Would you say that that is the wrong approach? That does not fit with a just culture, and we should perhaps sweep that away?
I think if there are rogue practitioners and dysfunctional managers, Sean, by the time that you start dealing with that, after all of the harm has been done, you guys are way behind the curve anyway. There are many other conversations to be had about recruitment, training, supervision, how you in fact get people to the places they are. So in some sense, it doesn't necessarily or shouldn't necessarily belong only in a just culture conversation. But I think the point you make is important in the sense that a lot of this often gets driven by fear, by anxiety, by the desire to manage beforehand your liabilities and to make sure that when the debris starts falling, it doesn't fall on your head. This is why we overly bureaucratize. This is why we have punitive responses to staff, because we need to be seen to do something. We need to get rid of the bad apples. As long as we are driven by fear, Sean, fear of the regulator, fear of the litigator, fear of the lawyer, fear of the family, we put an end to the conversation very quickly. And so what we need to be looking for, and it's sitting on the couch right next to you, is the courage to do it differently, to say, you know what, this is not working. We keep harming patients, we keep turning over staff, we keep having a significant liability and litigation bill or invoice, and so let's change the way we do things.
And I think that's really interesting. Let's change the way we do things then. So we've got a lot of people in the room here, Sidney, who are working day in, day out in the NHS, in organisations which aren't following your theory. What can individuals within teams, and perhaps managers here today who are thinking, well, I might try and implement a just culture in my team, how do they individually bring this about? Can they do that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The evidence, again, is growing, Sean, and that's the conversation we shall soon have with your guests. But the first thing that anybody can do is to respond to signs of failure, not with a willingness to make it go away, to punish, to be retributive, but with compassion and a desire to learn, to understand that fallibility is something that we all have, being human. It is to ask 3 simple questions. Who is hurt? What do they need? Whose obligation is it to meet that need? If you start every confrontation of bad news with those 3 questions, a whole different repertoire of conversations flows forth from that. You are the one sitting there, 1,000 people that have the power to make that difference every day. Who is hurt? What do they need? Whose obligation is to meet that need? And from there, and then I'll be quiet, but from there, Sean, there's a whole bunch, a whole menu of managerial interventions that are different from how things are being done now that are relatively quickly implementable. Freeze your suspensions, or at least make sure that they're checked off by somebody above you. Make sure that you don't just kick people out because it costs money, a lot of money, and it makes very little sense in terms of learning. Do everything you can, relentlessly, to identify downward pressure on people's willingness to be open and disclose, either to your managers, but particularly patient families, and hunt it down and start doing something about that downward pressure. Those are things we can do today. Support the staff that are coming in for support. Celebrate the fact that they're coming in for support. So there's, and Joe will have more, but there's a menu of managerial interventions, initiatives that can be taken to drive this restorative just culture.
I am going to bring in our panelists in a moment, but a last question from me, Sidney, and I hope you can stick around as well and join in the debate. But we've got Josephine on stage here, who has her own story as a bereaved mother. And I wanted to ask you, that I have had conversations with families who fear that just culture actually means no blame and actually means no accountability. And they worry that just culture is actually will harm their interest in terms of getting answers and being dealt with it. That's a misconception of the idea of just culture, is it?
So, is that to me or Josephine?
Yeah, that's to you.
Okay, utterly. And so in my own experience with similar harm, it very much is a misconception. The misconception, Sean, lies in the idea of accountability. No blame does not mean no accountability. In fact, no blame typically means more accountability. Accountability is about the ability to tell your account, to share your account, to learn from your account. As long, however, as we see accountability as something you have to pay, you pay your account, you settle your account, then of course it goes off the rails, this idea. But accountability is about telling, sharing, learning, improving. Patients are the first ones to benefit from that.
Oh, Sidney, that was really enlightening. I think that's been very interesting to hear your theory about this. But actually, I want to bring Joe Rafferty in now from the Mersey Care Trust, because Joe, you've been actually trying to do this on the front line. Just talk us through what it is that you've tried to do at the Trust.
Yeah, okay. So we've had the pleasure of working with Sidney, and we were very clear at the time that we liked the idea of a restorative approach, but we were really clear in the organization that we needed to develop a set of practical principles rather than a sort of very encouraging set of theory. I suppose one reflection is it's a really difficult question because I don't think you can buy it off the shelf. You have to be prepared to sort of work your way through this. But we got into this following 3 deaths on 1 unit a number of years ago. And just following Sidney's comments, we felt we had to do something. So we suspended 3 people who led those units. And probably for me, that was the worst decision I've ever made as a chief executive. At the time, I was following the we need to do something approach, and that feels like the right thing to do, and suspensions and neutral act and all of those sorts of things when you think about it. So what I really did was drive learning underground with those actions rather than bring learning to the surface. And that's what we've been trying to really get at as an approach that will allow us to bring learning to the surface. We have an organization that has invested a lot of money in good quality improvement and good staff support in many of the things that we feel are absolutely critical parts of being a good organization to work in. But I think really where we've started this from is realizing that we spend a lot of time doing rational things because it feels like these are the right things to do. But in a just culture, we're trying to tackle the irrational. So we asked 400 of our staff over a period of a year, what did it feel like? The moment when you want to crawl under the table when you see a result that says 50% of your senior staff fear, blame, and shame, even being sacked when something doesn't work out in the organization. It's a horrible feeling as
Quite sobering.
Sobering beyond belief. So we set out to think about a set of practices. So we built a supporting colleagues practice. So when something goes wrong, it's not appropriate, I think, for it to take weeks, even months, to get support around colleagues, the second victims in this. So now we work very, very hard to get true support for colleagues in and around people really, really quickly. We try not to officialize that. So we describe that as no suits allowed. So the suits, me, Amanda, my other colleagues, don't go. We have independent people who go, and we have trusted staff support colleagues. And that's support, but it's the start of a really rapid debrief for very serious incidents. We then enable learning. We assume learning happens, but in big organizations, these things don't stitch together just automatically. So we have a microsite for Just Culture that is all about the practice of learning and sharing information. We have established a process called Just and Learning Reviews, where anybody can say, stop the process. We think we want to have a debate about the next step, because we don't think this is quite right. And we've had some small number, but some really important things happen in the organization now where that's happened, where junior colleagues have challenged senior colleagues, very senior colleagues, in fact. And we've had a debate, not about right or wrong, but about what are we living the Just Culture principles and practices in our organization, and then move on. We have looked at our 72-hour review reports and done something really, really simple. given the reports back to the people who've been involved. I don't know how many of you work in organizations where the 72-hour reviews are not returned to the people who were involved in those incidents. And then we scratch our heads bewildered that learning doesn't take place. So really simple stuff.
I was just going to say, I was just going to pick you up there. Some of this does seem like really simple changes. Have you seen a benefit? Is there evidence? As Sidney mentioned, you have evidence that this
Yeah,
is working.
we do have evidence. So, so one of the things we said, because we've co-produced this entire piece of work, certainly with our patient population, our staff population, and our staff side union colleagues. And they said to us, they laid a very simple challenge on the table. They said, we think the level of disciplinaries and suspensions are too high in this organization. It's hurting our staff, the second victims. It is driving learning underground. We want to see that change. In 2006, as a sort of running average around the trust, we had about 35 disciplinaries a month with 6 or 7 suspensions at any one stage. So that has now more or less dropped in one of our big divisions to close to 0. It just bubbles along. And in the other division, it's getting close to 0. So over the 2 years, we've had an overall 59% reduction in disciplinaries. And during those 2 years, by the way, we doubled the number of staff we have in the organization because of acquisitions. We've seen an 89% reduction in suspension. In 2016, we spent £1.1 million on clinical suspensions, covering the cost of clinical suspensions. In 2018, so far, we've spent less than £50,000. Wow. Overall, we've seen absenteeism reduced by 0.5%. 1% absenteeism due to sickness and absence is about at £1.5 million. So that's a significant financial gain. We reckon when we put together the impact financially of this, we have about a £5 million saving. We'd say £2.5 million of that safely we can attribute to the Just and Learning Culture approach. We've seen our number of incidents reported rise, and we've seen the number of adverse incidents rise. We've seen more staff report for our support services, this time not talking about being bullied, but now talking about needing support in order for them to come back to work and feel like an active part of the community. So you can piece all of those things together, and there are many drivers in that, Sean, but what this has done, I think, is to fundamentally begin the change in the organisation. So now when things happen in Mersey Care, I think what we see is most staff will say, do you know, I can accept that that's in the cock-up space rather than the conspiracy space. It's built a sense of trust in the endeavour that we're trying to get at.
Yeah. And Sidney, I don't know if you can still hear us, but your reaction to what Joe said there, if you can. No?
Beautiful, beautiful. It's wonderful to see these things come to life and to be embodied and changed and beautified and improved in the process, Sean.
Is that the way to do it? By your assessment of Mersey Care, is that they're on the right track?
Oh, no, those are two different questions. I mean, they're definitely, if there is such a thing as the right track, definitely, yes. Is that the way to do it? No, there is no the way to do it, because there's only one Mersey Care. It has to be contextualized relative to where an organization is, how large, what they do, whether they have a Joe and an Amanda who's the HR director there. So it will depend on local circumstances. But some of these things will certainly be visible in other organizations trying this, and some of the results, some of the good outcomes, will certainly be equally measurable in other organizations.
Okay, just wanted to bring Josephine in now. Josephine, talk to us first of all about what happened to you and your family, but then I want to ask you about what you think a just culture could mean to a family.
So thank you. So I don't have very much time, and it's going to take me, a few minutes to tell you about my 21-year campaign to get justice. And it's only when I tell my story that I feel that you can understand, as a kind of personal experience, what that means in practice, what a just culture means in practice for someone who's been harmed. And I feel that the patient safety movement has failed to get the balance right between developing a non-punitive culture and one where there is appropriate accountability. I don't think we've got that balance right. So my daughter Krista was born with a heart condition called Fallot's tetralogy, which required major surgery. And she had this surgery shortly before her second birthday at a leading London specialist cardiac hospital, the Royal Brompton. The surgery was successful, and Krista went on to lead a normal, happy childhood with her twin sister, Kelly, and she didn't experience any problems. Shortly before her 16th birthday, she began to complain of chest pain, and so was admitted for cardiac catheterization in January 1996. She was discharged, and we, her family, were told that nothing had been found, she was absolutely fine, there was nothing to worry about, and we would be sent a clinic appointment shortly. Krista phoned and asked for that appointment 6 months later in June, when we hadn't heard anything, and she was told to come back in a year. And then on the 5th of December 1996, in what I now describe as my old life, on a day when I just came home from a normal day at work in my role as a senior lecturer in social work, I found Krista dead at home in bed. No goodbyes. Gone in a heartbeat. She was 17 years old, and she had died from acute heart failure. And I didn't know anything about that. And it's been in the process after she died that I've really come to understand what an unjust culture means in an institution that should be caring for families. After Krista died, I contacted the hospital, but nobody bothered to return my call, and we'd been under the care of that hospital for 17 years. My GP then gave me the catheterization report that showed Krista had had a number of problems with her heart and should have been given a follow-up appointment 6 months after her catheterization. We'd never received that appointment, and we didn't have the report. I don't know if any slides are going to come up there. There you go. Right. Actually, that's jumped on too far. No. Can I go backwards?
Try the other one.
I think there is another.
I think they maybe.
Oh, there you go. All right. Yeah. So this is the first part of the situation where we started to know what an unjust culture was. I wrote to the coroner's court because I then realised there were major concerns seeking an inquest. And he refused me an inquest, stating that Krista had died of natural causes. He wrote quite frankly what information you were given and whether your daughter's death could have been prevented or postponed is not a minefield I'm inclined to enter. Where is the justice? I was then forced into the complaint system 3 weeks after Krista's death. The response to my complaint and to an independent panel review via the hospital was that they had done nothing wrong and nothing could have prevented Krista's death. And so 2.5 years after Krista died, in response to a whistleblower, I went public and many other families came forward. A Department of Health inquiry was set up which reported back in 2001, making 120 recommendations for the hospital to change its practice. It had no remit to look at negligence, but maintained the hospital had not been negligent in Krista's case. And it stated that it had found no evidence which would warrant any referral of a doctor to the GMC. And so this left me with no choice but to pursue legal action. And I went into court risking everything that I owned, because after the inquiry, I had to get into court because of the legal time limits, and I couldn't afford the £40,000 insurance. The judgment in December 2001 marked the 5th anniversary of Krista's death. The judge accepted that Krista should have been followed up and kept under active review, that Krista, her GP and I told her ventricular tachycardia was a cause of clinical concern, and that Krista needed to be told to avoid severe physical exertion and to reattend the hospital if symptoms persisted or other symptoms appeared. The hospital was found negligent for failing to organise suitable further appointments for Krista. the negligence causing the loss of any opportunity to test for further deterioration in Kristas' condition or provide further information about developing symptoms. However, I still lost my court case on causation because the hospital argued successfully that despite their negligence, Krista would have died anyway, and costs of £120,000 were awarded against me. Where is the justice? In 2002, my lawyers found errors in that court judgment, and they told me that I had good grounds for appeal, but I was denied legal aid and I could not afford to go back into court. I then found that the Evans inquiry had omitted to mention that a significant number of the complaints that went to it were about a particular doctor, the one I hold responsible for my daughter's death. Many of those complaints illustrated a wider pattern of not giving key information and treatment to families like Krista. I also found that evidence from Professor Somerville, a senior cardiologist previously employed by the Brompton for many years, was withheld from all Brompton inquiries into Krista's death. She has stated in writing, and she said, say it publicly, that she believes Krista's death was negligent. And so finally I tried to navigate my way through the regulators, and after the mid-staff's inquiry, I wrote to Robert Francis about Jane Somerville's evidence not being put to Brompton inquiries, and he responded saying, if the material you refer to was available at the time and should have been given to the various inquiries but was not, then it could raise a question mark over the validity of those processes. I would respectfully suggest that is a concern that you may wish to raise with the Ombudsman. Well, I did, with the Ombudsman, the Department of Health, NHS London, the CQC, and all of them failed to take action. And so Dr. X, whilst he's not currently registered to practice, went on to act as a medical expert in the courts and for the NHSLA for years. Dr. X was still sitting on the Ethics Committee at the Brompton in 2016. So to talk more broadly about the issues, I sit on the Learning from Deaths Programme Board, and last November, up to 100 families came and told their story. These were families that had lost a loved one and told us about the harm. And whether that person had lost a relative recently or whether they'd been fighting for years, there were similar themes coming up time and time again. A lack of compassion, stigmatizing, blaming, and not listening to the victims. Where is the justice? A huge balance of power between large corporate organizations with unlimited resources to defend themselves and family members. A lack of independence in investigations and a cover-up culture which deny families the truth when harm occurs. A lack of candor, openness, poor information and communication, and a failure of the regulatory bodies. And this is what Jeremy Hunt said after the Gosport inquiry, which resonates with all of the themes that came up with the families in the Learning from Death programme and indeed in my own case. He said there was a catalogue of failings by the local NHS, the Hampshire Constabulary, the GMC, the NMC, the coroners, and a steward of the system, the Department of Health. Had the establishment listened when junior NHS staff spoke out? Had the establishment listened when ordinary families raised concerns instead of treating them as troublemakers, many of those deaths would not have happened. In quoting Bishop James Jones, the inquiry chair, the Secretary of State said, "What has to be recognised by those who head up our public institutions is how difficult it is for ordinary people to challenge the closing of ranks of those who hold power. It is a lonely place seeking answers that others wish you were not asking." And so in conclusion, I just want to return to my own story. In February, I stood up at a patient safety conference like this, and Jeremy Hunt was speaking. And I thought to myself, because I normally stand at the back of the room, because I don't get asked very often to tell my story because it's not one that people want to hear. And I thought, I am no longer prepared to stand at the back of the bus of the patient safety movement as a harmed patient and as a black woman. And I wanted to ask a question about discrimination, and I wanted to ask the Secretary of State to listen to my story. He invited me into his office, and I did feel that he listened. And I feel that the patient safety movement has to listen. And he has asked his civil servants to review all the evidence in my case and to make any recommendations for action that he might take. It's a time for justice for my daughter. Thank you.
Well. Josephine, thank you for that. And I obviously, one of the reasons we asked you onto the stage is also because since what happened to you, you've become a researcher and you work in this field now. And one important question I wanted to ask you as a patient on the panel or as a family member, a just culture, as what Mersey Care are trying and Sidney describes. What does a family want from just culture?
Well, I feel that they want the balance between developing a non-punitive culture. We don't want individuals targeted. I think that people understand, particularly if you talk to them about patient safety, that there are systemic issues. But they want accountability as well. They need to know what happened if a loved one dies, and if that person has been harmed, then there may need to be accountability. And it's not about targeting individuals, it's about also holding large corporate organisations to account. And I just don't, I think that the dominance of a no-blame culture has drowned out any discussion of issues of accountability and has often meant that harmed patients have been vilified, as well as the courageous whistleblowers that often speak up.
And you agree with that, presumably?
Yeah, I 100% agree with it. I think actually we've had a huge blaming culture, across the NHS. And I think what has happened is organisations just simply blew up. And the result has been this terrible imbalance that you talk about, from the financial mountain you have to climb to represent yourself in court, through to getting the simplest response from an organisation. And, our whole focus around a just culture has been to create transparency, candour and learning. And definitely our view is it is not an accountability-free system, but it is about trying to take a prospective view of accountability. What can we learn? What can we fix? How do we make sure these things never happen again? And then for those people who need to feel the sharpest end of the accountability sort of spectrum, then we do that in an evidence-based and fair way. And for those who need to feel accountability, but in a different way, that can be through a compassionate response, a coaching response. It's not a simple, binary thing in this respect.
Yeah.
But we've got simply to start to create that sense of justice in our organisations if we're going for just Josephine and the many, many others to redress this balance, to get the first and second victim thing straight. So, a part of our just culture approach is something we call PEARL, a process of early resolution to loss. So, and we've carried this out a few times where the trust has been at fault.
Yeah.
And simply to say to someone bereaved, first of all, we're sorry, and we mean it, truly sorry. And can we settle with you? Yeah. We don't mean settle for less or get away with something. Just stop on this 8.8 years on average to get a settlement through the litigation authority, plus the piles of heartache that you've got to go through. Yeah. I think our system has to be better than that.
Okay, we're running out of time now, I'm afraid. We've got to stop it there. But I think this has been a very interesting panel. We probably could have had a whole conference on just culture. I'm really grateful for Sidney making time for us all the way from Australia. And for Joe, I wish you the best of luck in what you're doing at Mersey Care. And Josephine, I thought your story was heartbreaking, but also it really resonated with what we're trying to all do here as well. But I think if we can all thank our speakers for it, I think that's great.